and welcome back to another of my series of videos on the philosophy of editing comics. I am Tom Brevoort. This is a summary of a talk that I give to the Marvel editors every year to impart the accumulated knowledge and wisdom that the more senior editors at Marvel have developed over the years, but that I believe is of value to anybody that might be interested in a career in editing comics. So I want to get into things now again straight away. This chapter is going to be a little bit more about thinking about story when it comes to comics, and specifically all of these points are very much Marvel points. They may apply to other areas, but there are some things that will not translate on a one-to-one basis. I am trusting that you are all smart enough to be able to tell which ones those are and to not try to make some, square peg fit into a round hole of whatever project you might be working on simply because I said it here. If you're listening to me that closely, you're probably doing this wrong. All right, so thing number one, and this is a recurring problem everywhere throughout the field of comics, specifically serially published comics, where an individual chapter is the equivalent of an episode and often doesn't comprise a complete story, but is only a sliver of a longer story that runs serially and that is eventually collected under larger hardcovers. And that is the question of clarity. In every single individual installment of a serialized story, you need to make sure that at the very least you are naming your key characters. And especially in worlds like Marvel's, where these characters often have superhuman attributes that are difficult to understand, even if you can look at them or know their name, those things need to be reiterated as needed as well. In the most practical terms, when it comes to the Fantastic Four, you can kind of look at the Thing and understand that he's big and strong. And you can kind of look at the Human Torch and get, oh, he's on fire. He's a flame guy. But the Invisible Woman's primary superpower is the ability to generate invisible force fields. And that is not at all clear from her superhero name, Invisible Woman, her human name of Sue Richards, or even visually when it just happens. It's the most challenging piece of editing Fantastic Four on a month-by-month basis, finding ways to communicate. She's making force fields, but it's absolutely essential. We should understand who we're reading about, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and not rely on the fact that, well, there's a Wikipedia out there and people can look it up on the internet, or, well, we explained that last issue or 2 issues ago, and I'm sure folks are following along and know all this stuff. If you look at, and I give you this challenge tonight, whatever television programming you happen to be watching, whether it's an episode of something that you're binging or something that's broadcast, whatever it is, just stop for a moment and watch how often the characters reiterate their own names and the names of all the people that they're speaking to. And even how often they reiterate their relationships. As my brother, you understand that. How can you do this when you're my wife and you're supposed to? Television does this routinely. And part of the reason for that is most of the writers who've been working in that field, at least up to the last couple of years, have been trained with the idea that every X number of minutes there's a commercial break, and at least back in the days of broadcasting, you had every chance of losing your audience every time a commercial came up. You also had a chance of gaining the audience when a commercial came up, and somebody might switch to your show halfway through or a quarter of the way through. So you have to be constantly reiterating what's going on, what the stakes are, who all the players are. And they do it this way, and they do it seamlessly. I've heard over the years from a lot of writers who don't like to use the superhero names because they feel like they're silly, and no real person would ever say that in conversation, to which my answer is, well, no real person is going to fly through the air or stick to walls either. But the character's name is Spider-Man. The character's name is Iron Man. You have to say it. It's not always good enough that it's on the cover. this is the whole reason why at Marvel for the last decade and a half we've been using recap pages, which contain some of the boilerplate information that we would have to reiterate issue after issue after issue, because the flip side of that is once you collect all of those stories into a single volume, it can get tiresome to have characters restating their origin time and time again. Born Again is perhaps the best Marvel story ever done, Daredevil Born Again by Frank Miller, but every 20 pages Miller has captions to tell you, I'm Matt Murdock, I was blinded as a kid by this radioactive goo that took my sight and enhanced my senses. And when you read it in a collection, by the 6th time you're getting that information, it does get a little bit tiresome. So we absolutely want this done with craft and with excellence, but it's better to have it there than to not have it there. It's better that the audience can understand what's going on and feel like, oh, I get it already a little bit, than it is to be going, what the who? What did he just do? How did that happen? You never want the audience to be confused about what's going on in the story, because if they are, they can't be invested in what's going on. They can't emotionally be in the moment, and that's the key. Again here, one of my old assistants, Mark Sumerak, had a line that he would use frequently with the people he was working with, which was, I can read your pages, I can't read your mind. So if whatever it is that you're working on is there only in panel descriptions to the artist or something, and it's not on the actual finished page, it's not there. You need to make sure that you're communicating all of the essential information to your reader. Additionally, everything should be dramatized. Every moment, every scene should be played for the greatest heightened state of emotion that you can. There are unending info dump sequences in comics, and by info dump I mean a portion of the story where a whole bunch of plot information has to be explained to the audience. And the dullest thing in the world you can have is 2 pages filled with tons of copy giving you the history of the Roman Empire, because it's essential information that you need to understand what's going on now, but it's dull. As much as is humanly possible, you want to make that information get across in a visual, interesting, and exciting fashion. The very fact that you're putting it there is great. You know, it's better that people have it than not have it, but do it in a dramatic fashion. As a general rule of thumb, this is not absolute, but I find that it is the case most of the time, you want your story to start at start. Start at start is a phrase that Marvel editors use an awful lot with one another, and it is a shorthand from not getting confused in Byzantine story structures that jump all over the timeline because you think that's cool. Typically speaking, and again, this is a generalization, and every tool that you have in your toolbox is potentially valuable in a given situation. But in theory, generally, the writers that enjoy and like Byzantine story structures tend to be the newer, younger writers. And part of the reason that they like opening 5 minutes from now and then jumping back to 20 minutes ago and then moving ahead to the year 2050 and then back to 5 minutes ahead of time is that complicated structure helps to hide the fact that there's no there in the story, that if you just laid the events out linearly, something would be missing, and that something is often the emotional component. Beware of Byzantine story structures that hide weak stories. As often as possible, you want to be straightforward. That doesn't mean you can't tell certain things out of sequence. It doesn't mean that you can't do flashbacks or cut time in interesting ways, if that gets to the essence of your story. But by and large, it is better to be straightforward, begin at the beginning, end at the end, and carry the reader along for that experience. All storytelling tools are valid, by which I mean that thought balloons, narrative captions, sound effects, and every other device that has been built to communicate information in comics all have their place and all are valuable. You have them all at your disposal as a creator, and as an editor, you get to choose which tools to use in every job you pick. These days, it's kind of fallen out of favor. It's become considered passé or cheesy or something to use thought balloons. And so a lot of writers just aren't comfortable with them, just don't like them. And that's fine for where it goes. That having been said, a lot of writers these days are effectively trying to write screenplays in their comics. They're focusing almost entirely on dialogue, and that's good if that's good for what it is, but it's not taking full advantage of all that the comic book medium offers. We're a visual medium, and we're a medium that allows the audience to get a greater understanding of the internal lives of our players, much in the manner that a novelist does. Part of what made Spider-Man such a huge success when he was first starting out was that not only was he having these crazy fights with the Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus, but you understood and could empathize with and relate to his emotional struggles while he was going through those fights. Having those thought balloons, having that running internal monologue is one of the things that allowed for that. And if thought balloons don't work for you and there's another way to get to that sort of thing, great. Certainly narrative captions work that way as well. But if you're limiting yourself to just what you could reproduce on film, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. Certainly, I've also worked with writers and creators who haven't liked sound effects, who also think that they're cheesy. And I'm okay with that up until the point where a sound effect is called for. And nobody has ever argued me on leaving a sound effect out when I need that sound effect to indicate that the door is open or the thing is falling or that something is happening that is not clear visually, because in comics we have no motion. These are still images for all that they're meant to capture a split second of rapid fire action. And sometimes you need the sound effect to help convey that to the audience. Another key thing to ask yourself when you're evaluating a script is simply, what are the pictures? The visuals that you're setting up must be interesting to look at, even in the quiet talky scenes, and especially in the quiet talky scenes. They also need to be interesting for the artist to draw if you're going to get the best work out of them. Too often, as I was saying, these days there are writers who either come from or aspire to working in film and working in broadcast, television, and streaming, who tend to approach what they're writing like it's a live-action drama. And they limit themselves to the kind of budgetary constraints that we simply do not have in comics. On a television show, you do kind of need to limit yourself to a small number of sets and environments because you can't create them infinitely, and a small number of players because you can't hire them infinitely without killing your budget. And a lot of that's going to be interactions where two people are just standing around talking. But in a comic, that same conversation can be happening on the deck of a SHIELD helicarrier, or soaring through the air, or at the center of the earth, or in some other super cool environment that adds some color and some drama to what's going on. And even if characters are having a talky situation where information's being exchanged or points of view are being danced back and forth, it's always nice to have some visual bit of business going on too. What are they doing with their hands? How are they sitting? Where are they moving? Are they knocking things off the table? Is there something that you can have them doing while they're interacting that is visually interesting? Comic books are a visual medium first. You see the pictures before you read the words, and the visuals are 80% of the experience for most readers. So you want those pictures to be critical. When Alan Heinberg was working on Young Avengers with me, the philosophy that he used in building all of his scripts was sort of the point of view of an original art collector. His take was, in a given issue, I don't want there to be any page of this comic that wouldn't be in demand on the original art market. And that meant that even in the scenes where he would have characters interacting in a very human, very personal way, Alan's Young Avengers certainly was a comic with a lot of heart and a lot of empathy to it, but he was always making sure that those were taking place in visually exciting or interesting locations or situations so that the end product, that page, was compelling visually to the audience and kept their interest so that he could hit them in the heart when he got to the emotional beat. When I am working on a comic book script that has just come into me, and I do this a little bit differently than a lot of other people, certainly even other people at Marvel. So this is just my preference and what works best for me, in part because I'm juggling so many things every week that it can be difficult to have to prioritize every single thing, and it's a system that I've developed over the years that works best for me. But when I'm looking at a script, my number one priority is this drawable? By which I mean, I'm not fussy initially with a lot of the specific copy in the script. Certainly, I want to make sure that plot points are presented and getting developed, that there's drama, that there's rising action, that characters all have moments to shine, that all the scenes contribute, that each scene closes properly, that we're delivering all the information that has to be delivered, or have places blocked out where those things can be done, where there is setup and payoff, where there is visual business. But I'm not fussing over every line of dialogue. I tend to leave that sort of polishing to the script and lettering stage. And part of that is I'm a real believer that you can't really get to the heart of the comic book before you have the visuals and the words together. There are things that seem like they will work in a script that once you get the art don't function the same way that you thought they would. Not because the artist didn't draw it right, but because their interpretation of whatever the direction was changes the nuance of what you're doing. Something that was supposed to be clear isn't clear. A moment that needs to convey a thing doesn't need as many words to convey it because the visuals carry more of it. And so to me, I tend to leave that sort of polish and fine-tuning to the point at which I'm ready to be either looking at lettering or about to be looking at lettering. These days, because lettering is all done digitally, things are a lot more flexible than they were when I started out, when we lettered books directly on the boards. In those days, you pretty much had to have your copy nailed at the time you were sending a book out for lettering. These days, and it's unfair to the letterers to make them letter a book 2 or 3 times because you can't make up your mind. So certainly you want a script that's going out to a letterer to be at least 80% on point. But in terms of all the real shading and fine-tuning that has to be done, to me, I need it to be when there's art and lettering together, and I can watch the ebb and flow of how the visuals and the words play on the page against one another. That's it for this time. Next time up, we'll start to get into some of the specifics of visual storytelling, the art part of things. Hopefully that'll be of interest to people. Until then, I'm Tom Brevoort. Thanks for being there.